Let's start. This doesn't sound, but we're streaming. So welcome to everyone who might be following us on streaming, and welcome to all of you coming here on a Monday morning, and welcome to the panel. Vaccination is a very important part, of course, of MSF operations worldwide, both in outbreak response, but also support to routine immunization programs in settings where there is a gap. And in 2016, we vaccinated over 1 million people against yellow fever, 170,000 against meningitis, 860,000 people against measles, as well as support then to routine vaccination in a wide variety of settings such as Niger, South Sudan, and Syria. Those are some very mind-boggling figures, really. And of course, for MSF Sweden here in Stockholm and across the country, access to vaccination has been an important issue since a number of years, both because of the Swedish government's strong role as a donor to the Gavi alliance, but also as here in Sweden, we have a very strong global health community that we also build on and interact with. And in 2014, we had the opportunity to hold a seminar at SIDA on access to vaccines in humanitarian crisis. For the last 2 years, we have focused a lot on the important issue of access to affordable vaccines. And therefore, we're very happy today to be able to welcome you for this very important conversation on the vaccine market today with such a knowledgeable panel and experts in their respective fields. And I'm very happy to see you joining us to listen in on this. So welcome to MSF Sweden and to this seminar, everyone. I'll hand over to Peter Jan.
Yes, thank you, Marie. So my name is Peter Jan van Eggermont. I'm humanitarian advisor for MSF Sweden, working in this office with vaccination, amongst other things. And today my role will be simply to have the pleasure to introduce our eminent panel to you. In order of appearance, we will have Ann Lindstrand, who's pediatrician and head of the vaccination program unit at the Swedish Public Health Agency, and has, amongst other things, specialized in PCV vaccination. After that, we will listen to Larsson, who is policy expert at the research-based pharmaceutical industry, the trade association for research-based pharmaceutical industry in Sweden, with over 85 members, which covers around 80% of the associate companies in Sweden. And last but not least, we will have the pleasure to listen to Kate Elder, who's vaccines policy advisor on the MSF Access campaign, which is a initiative within MSF, mainly supporting our operations in increasing the access to affordable and adapted vaccines and pharmaceutical products for MSF operations. So what we're going to do today is we're going to listen to each one of our panelists for about 10 minutes each. After that, we will have a conversation between them, which I will be introducing and moderating. After that, we will open up for your comments and questions. There might be some people dropping in. There was many more who registered who are not here yet, so don't get disturbed if people drop in. And that will conclude our morning. So looking forward to a nice conversation with you. And as said, we will start with listening to Ann Lindstrand. Here you go.
First, I have a disclosure. I am an MSF at heart. I've been a member for 20 years. So just so you know. But I'm here as a state bureaucrat working for the National Immunization Program in Sweden. And as such, I would like to give you the impression of the frustration of a program manager who doesn't access vaccines. I can tell you that in 2014 and 15, Sweden faced quite large vaccine shortages. It was first BCG that we didn't have enough. And then there was 4-valent and 5-valent vaccines. Suddenly, we were faced with the long-term shortage. We couldn't get the vaccines. And this, in addition, it was at the time of the Easter 2015, where there was an increase in asylum seekers, 162,000 new arrivals in a very short time. So there was this vaccine shortage and increased demand at the same time. And even for the asylum seekers, we didn't have any firm understanding of what were the needs of these newly arrived. So this was very, very frustrating, and a strong reaction, which was healthy from the public, saying, you know, we demand vaccines, we want our vaccines. So what we did was trying to get a grip on who needs the vaccines most, and then tailor new recommendations, and actually, you know, wait for older children and give the vaccines early on to the infants. But we've really quickly realized that this is not a shortage for just Sweden. It was a global shortage, and it was sparked somehow by a lack in the acellular component of the combination vaccines. This was due to a switch from middle-income countries from wholesale acellular pertussis combination vaccines to acellular components. So suddenly there was a huge global demand, and industry had not been able to, I don't foresee this, or been able to build enough factories to produce according to the global needs. And there were some simultaneous quality control problems, and some batches were stuck, and so all this became very, very frustrating. At the moment, we do have vaccines for children in Sweden. There are some changes and still recommendations that needs to be put in place. We've had shortage in the school-leaving dose. The 4-valent, we have an exchange product, the same with BCG. And then we are frustrated to see that industry doesn't produce single vaccine diphtheria any longer. The tetanus vaccine single dose, for those maybe being hesitant and choosing and picking what vaccines they want, is also not available at the moment. And there's an exchange in the rabies vaccine. And on and off, during this summer, there's been a hepatitis A vaccine shortage as well. Highly frustrating at the time when people are moving and traveling, and people do demand it. But just this is an example from Sweden. And I know that my colleagues around the world, they face the same problems, but sometimes at a much higher scale. At the time when we managed to get some of the 4-valent to vaccinate, 4-valent and 6-valent to vaccinate our infants in 2014 and 15, my colleagues in Eastern Europe, for example, they wouldn't even have an answer to the procurements they did. So there was a market, people were pulling in and grabbing the vaccines available, which was very frustrating. Particularly, I know Bosnia was nobody answered to their needs and their procurement. There is a need to guide policy and recommendations to have a dialogue with industry very early on. And I know that with our recommendations many times, we did recommendations and then suddenly the industry would call us up and say, well, hey, we don't have that vaccine in the country. So we learned, and I think it's the same thing on a global scale. Where there was the recommendation that all children around the world should have IPV and 1 dose at least. And the same thing happened. Well, industry wasn't really prepared. And so they have to build very quickly on. So we need a very good and early on dialogue on global needs and policy recommendations with the industry. I'd like to say, because we're here to talk about access and maybe more on prices than anything else, WHO has an interesting program, and I accessed this year's report in advance from WHO, and it's the V3P, Vaccine Product Price Procurement Initiative. So we, as program managers, we send in, or we're asked to send in every year information in a form called JRF, the Joint Reporting Form. All countries of WHO are sending to WHO information about vaccine coverage, diseases, etc. And now they've added a module on price. And it's been going on for a few years, but suddenly from last year to from 2015 to 2016, there's been like a surge of countries. Before there was like 50, now there are 144 countries reporting prices on vaccines. So what does WHO do with these things? Well, they do statistics, they check, they make public, as much as is possible to make public, the prices on websites, etc. And this is kind of very useful information. So what is learned about this? Well, that, for example, that vaccine prices around the world is stable or maybe even declining with time, except for actually UNICEF and PAO prices, which are slowly increasing. And this is interesting because you can see that UNICEF and PAO, as a pool procurement mechanism, is very, very keen on keeping a very good relationship with industry, of course. So ensuring multiple manufacturers and then not purchasing always from the lowest price, but really keep the different manufacturers on the market, which is probably very, very wise. And then talk about long-term commitment. It's also about payment guarantees and payment in hard currency. So they're of course, the most important global actors when it comes to vaccine procurement of low-income countries. What we also learn is that there is no really good mechanism. You can't see that there's a link between GDP and high prices. It's really variable. Within middle-income countries, you have a wide range of prices. In the high-income countries, there's an even higher increase between max and minimum prices. So in high-income countries, there's a 30 times difference between the lowest vaccine, you know, the price of a vaccinated child, and then a 30 times difference within high-income countries. In middle-income countries, not Gavi and PAO countries, there is a 14 times difference of how much money you spend for vaccines. And then in the Gavi countries, there is about, I think it's a 6-time difference. So this it's all a very good way of actually accessing and seeing. Price transparency makes a more fair dialogue in some ways for a country manager who needs to procure and try to understand what is my role and what is my, you know, margin of bargain or so on. So I think that this is a very, very interesting initiative by WHO. And they actually boost themselves because they say that this has already made changes. For example, the Baltic countries, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, has now decided to go together and do procurement together. And so they've managed, after some initial problems, to lower vaccine prices in a joint procurement of higher volumes. Interestingly enough, PCV is the vaccine where you have the highest diversity of prices globally and also within the different income categories, high and middle and low income countries. Now, how much time do I have?
2 minutes.
Nay. Okay, but I'll talk later on instead. I just want to mention that the Gavi is now into a very interesting movement. They're into the vaccine investment strategy process. A process that takes place every 5th year. And right now there's a large consultation around the globe on which ones should Gavi put money on. So there's a short list now after WHO gave them some advice on which vaccines now to increase. So there's a list of 20 vaccines and monoclonal antibodies, which is either Gavi investment portfolio that needs maybe to be changed or increased, like the 2-year booster, or that they're only licensed but not in the portfolio of Gavi, and then vaccines that are going to be licensed before 2023. So 20 vaccines. What strikes me when I read this paper is that, God, how can health systems manage? You know, should we just put 20 new vaccines and antibodies, you know, in the pipeline? How would that happen? There are 3 that should be given to mothers, pregnant mothers. And Gavi is maybe not looking at devices and platforms the same way. You know, it would be good to have a one shot, and then you can have Group B streptococcus, RSV vaccination, and influenza in the same shot. That would be very practical, instead of having to do, you know, 3 vaccinations on each antigen. So looking at new platforms and maybe new devices, giving out vaccines in a more practical way than we've done for centuries with vaccines, you know, syringes and needles and so on. But it is a driving market process, and we need to look at what are those 20 vaccines, because they will shape the global market in the future. And since I have no more, I'll talk about a European study later on in this debate.
You will.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dag.
Okay, obviously I'm here to represent the industry, and I sincerely wish there weren't this type of shortages that you mentioned, and if we face that in a country like Sweden, that's one thing, but it obviously have ripple effects throughout the world. I'm employed by the Swedish Industry Association for the pharmaceutical industry, the research-based industry. I've been working for member companies, and they are almost always global, and they're global in the same way as MSF and other organizations we mentioned are. So my role here is probably to provide one view that isn't necessarily the view of each individual member company, because obviously each company make their own decisions, and they operate within their own kind of logic, if you will. One question really that Ann touches upon is how come these companies become fewer and fewer to some extent, and that's probably nothing you can regulate, and you can only support a model that fosters and gives business conditions for startups. In the vaccines area, we rely on also manufacturing capacity, which is very difficult, or at least it's very expensive to scale up, and that provides a threshold, a hurdle for anyone, a new entry in this area. And then the other side of the industry in terms of vaccines is obviously to maintain a capacity or incentives that are interesting enough from a company point of view in terms of looking at alternative investments as well, where it's interesting enough to still invest in developing vaccines. It could be to provide those that have a broader coverage, and perhaps the technical platforms that Ann is mentioning as well. So that's an important part, that there are still incentives to kind of make it attractive to do this type of things. So I believe that the pharma industry has evolved over many decades, and it's actually evolving together with the regulatory framework we operate within. And if you go back, maybe I should mention that I think we should look at vaccines in the context of the rest of the R&D engagement that this life science industry has. It's only one part, even if it's a very important part, and it's obviously a part that clearly saves lives. And in that, it's important to have somebody kind of challenging the industry as well, and I think MSF and other organizations provides the challenge in a very healthy way. But if you look back at the regulatory development that has taken place, it's not that long ago, about when I was born, we had basically chemical controls that it wasn't completely, it was the right content, if I say so, in a pharmaceutical pack. And then came concerns about safety. We all are aware of the catastrophes that took place, and that increased the level of regulation and the requirements for the pharma company in terms of demonstrating that the drugs that we were selling were safe. And then came an era of also establishing evidence behind efficacy, so the randomized control trials and the meta-analysis, etc., came into play. So now we are talking about a fair balance between risk and efficacy then, as the fundamental factor that determines whether you can have a drug on the market or not. And then we're also evolving into a more important discussion where you include safety and efficacy, but also then the economical side of the story, the value of the drug. And that's very much where we are, and I think we are also in a way moving out of the value story into some kind of shared risk story, which is also the case for very specific treatments for subsets of individual cancer forms in the wealthy country, and as well as I think the challenge that Gavi and other organizations provide to the industry in terms of trying to negotiate prices, trying to find means of tiered pricing, and I think it's quite appalling to hear the range of price differences that Ann is reporting here. And I can't obviously explain why that is. I think it's just an opportunistic result of an opportunistic market, and this is not really a perfect market, because obviously there is a need that won't go away. You can't turn anywhere else. You need to buy from a very limited set of providers, and so it's then we need to have a very good dialogue in order to be able to find a way forward for this, because I think, and this is my kind of final comment here, the pharma industry, including then the vaccines industry, can only sustain in the long term if it's successful in doing two things. And one is to continue to develop drugs or vaccines that meet medical needs. In order to do that, you need incentives in some way or fashion. Otherwise, we will only perfect what we already know, and not engage in anything that meets additional medical needs. And as we know, there are plenty of those needs around us, but also throughout the world. The other job that the industry is here to do, really, and must be successful in doing, to make sure that these products get used, and that includes an acceptable pricing, a fair distribution, a production mechanism that allows, or at least is being allowed, a sufficient time horizon to meet the varying needs, etc. And I think that's where I'll stop for now.
Thank you, Doug. Kate?
Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Ann. And thank you very much to MSF Sweden for organizing it. I don't think people online can see that it's a bit of a rainy and gray day today in Sweden. So it's very nice to see people coming, and weekend. So it's very nice to have people coming out to kick off the week with us in this interesting discussion. Just to sort of build on what Marie was saying at the opening in terms of why is MSF involved in this field. I mean, MSF is a medical humanitarian organization. A large part of the medical care that we deliver is vaccination. It's something that we've been doing since the founding of our organization. And in 2015, 5.3 million doses that we administered of vaccines in over 30 countries. Our work is affected by the prices that we pay, because we spend our donors' money on vaccines. The products themselves, are they easy enough to use in the context in which MSF works, which are very difficult consequences, I think everybody knows. And are they able to get, or do we have the strategies to get those products to children or people who need to be vaccinated? So we, as a medical organization, we spend our donors' money on vaccines, so the price is really a concern to us. And we're working in the field to optimize those products, to lower the prices, not only for ourselves, but for other medical humanitarian organizations as well as governments, because we get a lot of feedback from governments Swedish government, other governments that we work with in terms of how those characteristics, prices or characteristics of vaccines or inadequate availability of vaccines, no supply, how they affect their work. So this is something that we have a critical stake in. And I will be using PCV. Ann mentioned PCV before, the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine. I'll use it as a bit of an example through some of the issues that I discussed, because pneumonia is the leading cause of death for children worldwide, killing over 800,000 children a year. And it's something that we face in our context. So MSF sees children with respiratory tract infections, which is obviously heartbreaking when those can be prevented with a very effective vaccine that we have. But I wanted to just quickly outline 3 issues. One, how the price of the package of vaccines is increasing for children. 2, what are the consequences of those high prices? So what do we see in the field of our work, and what do we hear from governments? And 3rd, what can we do about it? Those 3 issues very briefly in my 10 minutes. But in terms of the price of the basic package of vaccines, the package of vaccines that WHO recommends for every child to have, has been increasing. 1, because we have more vaccines that are being added to that package, which is excellent. As new products come online, as we can prevent new diseases, it's really a gift that the industry is giving us new products to prevent those types of diseases. So I don't want to minimize the point that the package that WHO is recommending is growing, but with that is coming a disproportionately higher price attributed to these new vaccines. So if you look at vaccines like the PCV vaccine, rotavirus vaccine, which is against childhood diarrhea, and human papillomavirus vaccine, HPV vaccine against cervical cancer. Those 3 vaccines in the package of 12 that WHO recommends for all children and adolescents, they account for about 86% of the cost of that package. And that's using the lowest global prices. Those are prices that Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, is accessing. So while there are more vaccines being added to the package, just the disproportionate cost of those new vaccines is quite notable. And this makes it quite a challenge for governments to introduce them and make them readily available to their children through national systems. Why are those prices high? Well, because we have inadequate competition in the new vaccines area. For the pneumonia vaccine, PCV, there's only 2 WHO pre-qualified manufacturers, GlaxoSmithKline and Pfizer. Similar for HPV and for rotavirus, not the same companies, but there's still 2 WHO pre-qualified manufacturers for each of this. So due to a lack of healthy market competition, the prices are opportunistic, as Doug said, and they remain high. So in terms of looking at the burden of those costs, just to also further in a granular level illustrate that, the PCV vaccine, if we have a global vaccine market industry worth about $26 billion per year, turning over revenues of about $26 billion per year, PCV accounts for 26% of that $26 billion. So that's the value of PCV in that global market. Whereas in terms of the volume of PCV doses being sold, it's only about 7% of the global volume of all of those vaccines. So just again to sort of illustrate disproportionately higher costs and value of some of these new products. And as Ann said, so I won't repeat it, when you look at different economic categories of countries in terms of the prices they're paying, in middle-income countries, it might be a 13-fold difference between the lowest price and the highest price. In the high-income countries, as Ann said, it's exponentially 30-fold difference in the price. So this is really, when we're talking about tiered pricing, which of course is trying to link the price to an economic categorization of countries, to have that vast a difference is still, it makes you sort of scratch your head and think that there could be maybe a more rational way of pricing vaccines. So that's sort of the price issue. In terms of what are the consequences of that? Well, the consequences of these high prices are that medical providers such as MSF, we just simply can't afford to buy them. So we can't afford to protect children in Libya and Syria and Yemen and Ethiopia and Niger and the number of countries where MSF works. We just can't afford to properly protect those children against these vaccine preventable diseases. Governments as well themselves then can't afford them. Governments are the big, MSF as a purchaser, we are tiny, tiny, tiny in the global market. We really don't mean anything to industry. We don't have, you know, huge value of our purchases. The purchasers that make a difference to industry, so we need to really be implicating and involving and having come to the table when we're talking about better strategies, are governments. They're the ones that are really buying it for all of their children, so they're really the ones that have the largest stake in it, and which are producing those revenues that I mentioned before for industry. But the consequences of these high prices means that governments then have to either buy those vaccines or not buy them at all, or buy them for select subpopulations. Some countries are introducing new vaccines on a district basis, trying to prioritize the poorest districts or the districts with the worst health profile. But those are the consequences, is that governments have to sort of ration where they're spending their money. And certainly, governments need to spend more money on health. I think across the board, I think we can all agree on that. Governments need to prioritize the health of their people, and they need to put their money where their mouth is, but they have to be given a fair shake, so to speak, in order to be able to do that. So we hear from different governments what these prices mean in terms of their ability to protect their populations. And a particular group of countries that I wanted to draw attention to is these so-called middle-income countries. We're very lucky that we have Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, which purchases vaccines for the world's poorest countries. So that's excellent. That's about 72, 73 countries that are having the donor community, CETA, NORAD, US government, many other governments pitching in to purchase vaccines for those poorest of the poor countries. The countries that have really been left out right now are middle-income countries. These are countries that don't qualify for Gavi support because they're just over the economic threshold, sometimes a negligible amount over that GDP threshold to make them eligible. But they have been feeding back that this basically means that they can introduce those vaccines. And just to give a sense, about 50% of the countries now that have declining vaccination coverage, and this indicator is children that are receiving the 3 recommended doses of diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus-containing vaccine. About 50% of the countries that have declining immunization coverage are these middle-income countries. So not only are they not able to introduce new vaccines, but they're also having poor performance and sliding performance on their immunization systems. Because it's not only a matter of can you afford the vaccine, but it's not enough to get that vaccine to the tarmac of your capital. You have to get it to the children and where they live. So the indicators right now for middle-income countries are rather worrying. These are countries like Brazil, Iraq, Ecuador, Romania, South Africa, Syria, where we see a decline in immunization coverage. And just to go back on the PCV example specifically, so about 60% of the world's children are not fully immunized with the 3 recommended doses of PCV. That's for 2 reasons. So I want to be clear. It's one, that the countries can't afford it, so it's just generally not available in the country. But it's also, secondly, that in countries where it is available, that it's not reaching the children. So that is an aggregate indicator. About 60% of the world's kids aren't fully protected against pneumonia, despite the availability of a vaccine. And what does that translate to into numbers? That's more than 81 million children around the world that are not being protected. So those are the consequences of these high prices. And then last, what can we do to start to remedy? I think Doug has made many good suggestions. It starts in places like this, where we're having this dialogue with all stakeholders involved. But transparency, just to build off of what Ann said, in order for governments to be able to negotiate a fair price, they have to have information. They can't be at an information disadvantage. So what V3P, Vaccine Product Price and Procurement, or whatever way the Ps are arranged, the V3P has done an exceptional job right now of trying to work on the imbalance, the information asymmetry. So I think in 2014, there were about 26 countries that were contributing. Countries have to voluntarily submit their data to this database. 26 countries in 2014, and in 2017, as Ann said, we have 144 countries. So this is exceptional work by the World Health Organization that we have to support, and they can't do it alone. We have to encourage governments to submit their price data so that they can all benefit from it. So price transparency. Not only the prices that governments are paying, But in order to be able to incentivize industry, as Dag said, we have to know, well, what are the returns that industry expects? What are those sorts of incentives very concretely? How much does it actually cost to create these vaccines? What is the cost of production? So also transparency on the research and development side and the manufacturing side. And that will, I think, be able to help us have a more informed and educated discussion. In addition to transparency, we have to look at reducing those barriers to entrance, to market entrance, so that we actually do have competition. Prices are remaining high when companies can be opportunistic because they don't have competition. So in order to break that, we need to facilitate the entry of additional quality assured manufacturers and their products. How do we do that? Well, we find incentives, as Dag said, in order to do it. We look at how we can address some of the barriers they face, regulatory barriers. And we also, and this is where I'm going to do a very brief plug for a new MSF report. We also look at the role of intellectual property in the development of vaccines. MSF has just released this report looking at the role of patents in the development of new vaccines, specifically looking at pneumococcal conjugate vaccines and HPV vaccines too. So what role does intellectual property and specifically patents play in manufacturers trying to develop competitor products? So, you know, we will use this as a tool as well to look at how we can facilitate more manufacturers entering the market. But I'll just stop there and we can get the discussion started.
Thank you, the three of you, and I hope you've all been feeling a lot of thoughts and reflections in your head when you were listening to each other, and I would just encourage you to feel like you're sitting in a cozy pub together, so you will be able to freely comment on each other. But maybe if we could just start with going to Dag, because it struck me, Dag, that you actually also seem to acknowledge that there is a problem with the current state of the market, and calling it non-perfect or appalling is a matter of where one wants to put the focus. But maybe it would be interesting to just hear those conditions that you see as essential for a existing and sustainable market, which we all share as a common hope, of course. Do you see any in MSF's description or MSF's diagnosis of the market where you see a conflict of how the current market is?
I think we all have different roles, and we should kind of keep the roles in a way, so that if I represent then the R&D and the manufacturing and the selling organization, then obviously I can't question really attempts to share prices between my customers, and so that's something that will happen if I have a product to sell. But let's say if I were the CEO of a company that did nothing but vaccines, then if I had reasonable margins, so I was leading a profitable organization, and I had the shareholders backing for considering investing further into the vaccines area, where would I put the money? Would I build yet another factory? Would I do more R&D in order to do new vaccines? Or where would I put the manufacturing plant? If so, I don't know the answer to these, but that's the type of question that you probably are facing in such an organization. But then, as we also mentioned, most of these companies do other things as well, and then it's a matter of alternative cost. Is this vaccines business more attractive than something else? And I've been in this industry for more than 30 years, and I've seen companies come and grow. The company names that were mentioned here that relates to the pneumococcal vaccine area, they've been kind of much smaller as companies previously and over that period of time, and they've also kind of faced situations where they start to kind of move down the ranking of the global pharma industry, and that means pressure from the outside, from investors moving their money to somewhere else. So they have to consider this. It's not a kind of an isolated discussion or decision that you can make within the company. As a company, you live in a context of where the money flows, basically, and so So that's the reality. But then again, WHO, MSF, others are probably supporting the countries quite well in terms of opinion, also the transparency of prices and so forth. And I think that's good kind of counter pressure to make the industry stand on their toes a little bit more in order to prove the value of what they actually provide.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to ask, because Kate is saying that this R&D and the manufacturing, there is a lack of transparency,
Mm-hmm.
how much that actually costs. Yeah. Is it because it's difficult to calculate? Is it because you want to keep that opportunistic maneuvering space of being able to take higher prices in certain areas and get your gains? Or, you know, why? And then the second question is what does industry, what do you think industry thinks about WHO initiative of the V3P? Because this really turns over the price transparency.
I don't know what the industry thinks, and obviously we represent the Swedish Industry Association. We're a member of the European Association, and that is in turn is the member of the international. So we're part of a community in that sense, and obviously I don't know exactly how they reason. I can't do that because they will be up to each company in itself. There is no kind of actually we're not supposed to, in any way or fashion, we're not supposed to collaborate on how we look at the business model. That would be competition law prohibitive and actually quite dangerous for a company executive to engage in that type of discussion. So in terms of the transparency of the cost components, I think it's a question we often get, but and we probably always give the same answer. It's not impossible to calculate, but then it is a matter of discussion how you calculate risk. So how you assess risk will be different from one case to another. And if you look at vaccines development in the context of all other R&D and development, then it's a matter of you need to be able to succeed and make money on the products that you take to market, that you're successful, and you need to kind of include in that calculation also the attrition rate for failed projects. And we know, for instance, that in the regular pharma market, all drugs, including vaccines, up to a third of the pivotal phase 3 trials that are supposed to kind of generate a regulatory approval is failing. And that's where you have a huge investments unfortunately those failures will have to be paid by also the selling price for a vaccine in a way. So this is not an area that is separate from other areas of the life science industry. It's incorporated in that sense. And this is why I took the example of if I were a CEO of a vaccines only business, that's a different set of questions than if I'm a CEO of a more diversified life science company.
Maybe I can just drill down on that too, because I hear what you're saying, Dag, and you're talking about the incentive model for products where there is a market, right? Where where a company has made a decision that there is revenue to be generated. So that's sort of one category of diseases where there are people who can pay for it, governments that can pay for it, which I think needs more transparency. And for all the reasons that Ann and you have just said, we need to have a more intelligent dialogue, because I don't think that there are forums where that's taking place. But I also want to draw attention as well then to the areas where there isn't a market and where pharmaceutical companies are going to completely ignore development of vaccines or medicines because they don't represent a commercial interest. And I think we need a whole other discussion and categorization of how we then develop those products, right? Because those are not even in the discussion of revenue generating vaccines. vaccines as well. And there are models that have been successful for doing that. There have been innovative ideas like the meningitis A product development, where there was money put in by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, technology from the US government as well as other governments, and a manufacturer based in India that had committed to a low price product, so that now we have a meningitis A conjugate vaccine, which is doing wonders in terms of its results, but wasn't invested in by the traditional pharmaceutical industry because it didn't represent a profit. So I want us to also be nuanced in that discussion as well, of where there is really no market to.
Anyone wants to comment on that particular?
No, just
There's
briefly,
alternatives?
it's absolutely true, and I believe this is why we're here now, in a way, because the only way of addressing those type of needs is really through some other type of collaboration, and some type of partnership. And just one brief comment as well. We operate within the intellectual property setting, and we obviously find that very important for our long-term sustainability. But then we also have governments regulating what we're supposed to demonstrate before we get something approved. We have governments, the same governments, investing in programs like the WHO. So we have to kind of welcome that in a way. So it's good to see. It's actually like putting your it's braking and accelerating in same time in a way for us, and that's probably good, and it's needed.
But there are other examples as well, of course, of markets where you have less needs. I mean, the Men-A vaccine has been sold now in I don't know, how 200, 300 million doses or something.
I can't remember.
It's actually a huge market now. But but the Ebola vaccine, for example, or the Zika, where you have boosts of many cases and then nothing, there is a much harder case, you know.
And we have
I think that the routine vaccines, it should be a very stable market, isn't it? Isn't it? You know exactly how many kids are born, and you want to, so it's easy calculate that this is the global market. This is what you.
Yeah, that's probably true. You know the number of presumed customers, but then you don't know what market share you will have and how your distribution across the world will be. So you need to take that in consideration when you plan your production. So and sometimes you will win and sell more than you think, or sell as much as you're capable of producing, and other times you won't. So that's also the reality of the company, I guess.
So just to follow up a bit on that last point, it seems that both sides, if one can simplify it in that way, have already stepped out their comfort zone to a certain extent. We are talking about new models, new private-public partnerships of all kinds. Some of our colleagues in the NGO field have now formal partnerships with pharmaceutical companies. So it seems it's moving quite a lot. If you could look in your crystal ball, Dag, and look upon, let's say, a 5 to 10 year basis, because I think you gave a very strong signal that there's also a risk that one scares away manufacturers, and that of course would be the worst outcome for everyone. So what do you think is going to happen on a 5 to 10 year basis, if you would allow yourself to think freely?
Yeah, I do think free, but it's hard to say within 5 to 10 years. But I'm intrigued by the I don't know what to call it really, whether it's a risk or an opportunity, or at least there is a likelihood of some kind of disruptive change in some of these areas. And we see similar things, and wish there were similar developments in the antibiotics area for treatment of bacterial disease, where we also in the wealthy countries are starting to dread the risks of multi-resistance and so forth. So in order to meet that, it's not you can say that our business model is not suited to address that, and then you need to find another way of doing it. And I think this is not too different from that. And before we know it, we will have a new disease again I remember vividly when in the beginning of the HIV era, where we had to struggle to demonstrate how these drugs worked, and eventually combination therapies with newer mechanisms actually move the treatment into earlier in the disease, and actually then you have chronic with HIV patients that are not contagious anymore. In somewhere in the middle of that, you had a situation where people really didn't trust the pharma industry to be a good partner in this area. And where I remember also being targeted quite hard in terms of question what our interests really were. But I think the model really proved to develop something good and deliver something good in that sense. And nobody questions the pharma industry's role in that, although there were a lot of research and development that also came from other financiers like governments and others.
No, I just want to say that I mean, there is a common goal, not just for global public goods. It's really increased coverage of both, you know, life-saving medicines and vaccines for pharmaceutical industry, as well as state agencies or the NGO world, of course. One thing that however, and then it is important that we find these market mechanism and a good dialogue early on for the best of mankind. How do we work together? But there is this problem of vaccine hesitancy, and how far can we be pals and being in dialogue without being, you know, colored with vaccine hesitance, because say it's global vaccine. There is vaccine hesitancy movement, not in just high-income countries. It's all over for different reasons and different groups and so on. But the most vaccine hesitancy is the most common used fear for people is side effects and maybe not less perception of the risks of the vaccines. But it's also the third comes in, and if you know, this is only the global big pharma who is trying to boost their own economy, and it's not for the global. So it's a very difficult dialogue to have, actually.
No, and I agree. It's difficult to get through in a balanced way into the general public, because you have other interests also, other initiatives that tells a different story, and who owns the narrative really gets the headlines, really.
Yeah, it's true.
Any spontaneous comments? Otherwise, I'll get a question. No, I just wanted to, because it's been such an important part of the of MSF's work on this issue for the last years, these huge price differences, which all of you either know or actively work with. I was just wondering, how much of a controversy is it really? Because obviously, if you state it like that, 30 times difference, you're like, wow. But it's not that all manufacturers wake up in the morning cold sweated saying that we have to rethink completely. In the end, it sort of disappears in these large multi-billion-dollar budgetary planning strains that somehow either get solved or people live with it. So I would be interested, because now there's this new development, WHO is actively taking place, but how much of a controversy will you be able to make this in? Kate, if you would like.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good, you know, what gets headlines, and I don't think quite often you see the issue of vaccine prices in the headlines. It would be much more around vaccine. Unfortunately, I spend all of my time trying to get the public to talk about it. Clearly, I'm not very successful. You know, but I mean, there are these forum, and I observe them, I've been watching them for a decade, a forum where governments are coming together and saying this. It's just who is the onus on then to make steps to improve the situation. For example, you know, we spend our time each year at the World Health Assembly, WHO's annual gathering of all member states, where they talk about these things. And in 2015, there was a global resolution by the WHO on adopted by all governments of the world, calling for lower prices and calling for more price transparency. So governments are taking steps in these intergovernmental forum to try and ring the alarm bell. How that then gets translated into what's concretely being done is really the issue. I mean, member states in 2015 called on WHO to do more around initiatives like Ann mentioned, pooled procurement, like it's happening in the Baltic states, looking at more upstream issues around research and development, as Doug has been talking about, furthering price transparency, where we have made great positive strides. But then who else is it on to do something? I mean, it's certainly on the governments themselves, but it's on also all these other international actors to think about how can their work then benefit these countries that are particularly hard hit? Like, as we mentioned, Gavi has done a phenomenal job for low-income countries. What can Gavi do to affect the market of middle-income countries that are being left out? What can big donors like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation do for middle-income countries as well? So it is indeed not in the headlines, unfortunately. But I don't think that means that governments haven't been expressing sincere alarm for a number of years. Yeah.
But the middle-income countries, it has been on the agenda for a very long time. And it seems like there needs to be a certain new actor coming in, or it needs to be solved in some ways, but there's not too many of the solutions that we see so far.
Yeah,
and more countries transitioning out of Gavi and into the middle-income countries.
Yeah, exactly. There's a third of Gavi eligible countries that are currently in this process of transitioning or graduating from Gavi support, and Gavi is looking at how they can try to ease the burden on these governments. But when you look at their responsibility for the prices that they, their financial contribution, domestic contribution towards the prices of vaccines that were introduced with international support, it is a very drastic increase in their burden. And again, yes, governments need to put their money where their mouth is and contribute more to health, but you have to make sure that you're giving them the best, easy gliding path into that. But I think another category of industry that we haven't mentioned much today, but which is very important in this market, is looking at what are called the developing country vaccine manufacturers. So manufacturers in India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Egypt, Brazil, Cuba. And what role do they play? Unfortunately, for the newest vaccines, they haven't been able to bring products to market just yet. We've been waiting for a new PCV vaccine since we were first told that a competitor in emerging economy would have one in 2018. It's not going to happen in 2018, unfortunately. So. They have a different business model, these companies. Their business model is volumes rather than the value. So when you look at the prices they charge the poorest countries and what they charge middle-income countries, it is a really negligible difference in terms of the price. But what they're going for is just selling many doses. So how can we, understand their constraints too, so we can, fast-track their entry to market?
So. Once again, the crystal ball will, if that market entry is going to happen, will that scare away the established players totally, or will they lower their prices?
Whether they will lower the prices, I don't know. But it's obviously you always have to relate to competition, and I'm thinking while listening to this, in the small molecule pharma business, then it's very clear with patents and patent expiries and a completely different business model. Once you're in a generic situation, you have plenty of manufacturers, and this is obviously there are very clear rules of engagement in that business. So it's everybody agrees on that, and then you need to sell your new product in the context of the price of the cheaper generics as well. But then, when listening to this, also this need to put together many vaccines into a common platform kind of is counter to the effectiveness of this generic model, really. And I don't know what the solution is, but I think that's certainly an area where that probably needs to be more work done in order to meet the expectations.
Yeah.
So you can honor the innovation in the same time as you have the efficiency of the way it's supposed to be in the intellectual property. The ones eventually you will lose your property, and you can't kind of have a perpetual protection by just adding things to a platform. So I don't know what the solution is. I promised I didn't promise I'd have some unicorn in my pocket in order to solve this, but yeah.
Yeah, but it's fantastic with all these new vaccine candidates.
Yeah.
But really, I do think it's difficult to just add and add and add and add new wonderful vaccines, and not see that, you know, the feeling of the parents, in the end, how many vaccines can a child take, how many shots can a child take, and really make those platforms early on would be wonderful. But I can't see either how the model would work, because you're looking at your little molecule here and your little molecule here, and then you want to have one shot given to the mothers with all these different vaccines. But that will take forever to make, you know, phase 3 to all the different phases. If you have a combination of vaccines for pregnant women, for the elderly, PCV, influenza, and then zoster vaccines, that would be lovely. Yeah. Instead of having 9 shots, you will have 1, 2, 3. You know, but that market model, I don't know if it will ever happen. Yeah. It would be best for individuals, but
I don't know. It's also, we need to recognize that this is a small country in a way. Somebody suggested that if the government here in Sweden would take half of the money we spent collectively on reimbursing products within the reimbursement system and build a manufacturing plant, that wouldn't take us very far either, because it's such a scale of this. So that would probably suffice to manufacture 1 vaccine.
So before we invite for some questions from the audience, any final comments on either that, or we briefly touched upon the role of development aid, and we will be talking more about this in the afternoon, Kate and I, with the colleagues at the MFA. But obviously, we cannot solve everything with public money through aid budgets or other things. There has to be some sort of a rational and predictable role for the normal market forces in this. MSF hasn't really provided the big solution either there. But if you would move ahead in 5 to 10 years, you already mentioned low price manufacturers from developing countries. Can you see any other short-term solutions on how to address this?
Well, I mean, it's nothing novel, but I do think that we are continuing to increase transparency and get more information on what the industry expects, and that I'm encouraged by. I mean, there's a lot of work going. It could be made, I think, more easy with the industry volunteering a little bit more information, but I think nevertheless we are working towards rebalancing the asymmetry of information so that we can have an educated discussion. I mean, MSF is certainly working on it. Last year we put out a report called Lives on the Edge, looking at how research and development is done, the R&D model. I encourage everybody to read it. And you know, through forum like this as well, I think that we're getting a better idea of what industry expects, and then not only, you know, from industry's mouth, but also then seeing what the market produces. I mean, I think Peter Jan had mentioned before, when is it, you know, too much and a company exits the market? I mean, in the pentavalent market right now, for those 5 vaccines, where we have a very healthy market, I can't remember off the top of my head how many manufacturers, but the price has been driven significantly down for UNICEF purchases, and what has that resulted in? It's resulted in a multinational exiting the market and, you know, deciding that it wasn't viable for them as well. So I think in addition to getting information, we're also seeing what the market forces produce. So that's informing us. So I hope in 5 years we'll just continue to have more information. Yeah. That would be my best.
Can I just say then that the Global Vaccine Action Plan, we're living right in the middle of the Global Vaccine Action Plan, and one of the very important pillars and goals is that you need to increase demand for vaccines, and you actually, the introduction of new vaccines is seen as the only success within the Global Vaccine Action Plan, because you have a huge increase of rotavirus, HPV, and PCV. And I wouldn't say I actually see it as a great success as well as WHO. 40% of the kids of the world do get it. If 60 doesn't. But I think that we can't just work on this side, but we need to work on the soft side, demand side. And the way they've framed it in WHO is that people need to know the value of vaccines and ask and demand vaccines. And I think that actor, how we do that, but that will also be, you know, if you put your own money into vaccines, you see the value of it, and you will actually have a personal contribution which is low for every person, but still that will also make a big case for introduction and stability on the global market, also in the middle income countries.
Yeah.
Well, if you ask about the 5 to 10 years again, then I think it's nothing unique and entirely new, but I take the signal of collaboration, contribution from the industry in a constructive way without being too close in order to shy away the vaccine users.
Yeah, exactly. That's good. Delicate balance.
Yeah.
Good. Well, I suggest to open up for possibility for the audience to ask questions or reflections, either to one specific person or to anyone to reflect upon. Please tell me who you are and what you work with. So let's.
Thank you very much. My name is Åsa Andersson, and I'm the Senior Technical Specialist at Health at SIDA. Thank you very much. It's been a really interesting discussion. Huge area, the whole vaccine. You know, you haven't even talked about supply chains and, you know, and resistance and everything. Anyway, what some of the things that I was but one of the things, I think it was you, Ann, who were discussing the shortage. And I was thinking, you know, how do you do the forecasting in a way? Is that an issue? Because are we good enough in understanding the forecasting in order to go into dialogues with the big pharma and see, you know, in the next coming of years we would need these kind of...
no, we're not. I don't think so. Not
okay,
enough.
I just have a couple of more.
Okay.
So that was one for you. And then I was thinking, Kate, you were talking about the middle income countries, and you know there are lots of discussions in Gavi and everywhere what to do with it, and these kind of transition that you're talking about. So what do you have any ideas on what does that mean? Is it that we're gonna, you know, subsidize it for a certain years or whatever? You know, because I do think that middle-income countries should take much more responsibilities than what they're actually doing today. And then the whole issue of generics, you know, I think, and you said that. Do I understand correctly that today the PCV that you're talking about, they are still in patent? That's why the generics are not coming in, or is it that, you know, it's a whole issue with the generics, but generics have done wonder for many diseases, for example HIV. So we need them, but of course I understand also the issues with the global pharma in it, but that was just it.
Yeah. Do you want to start?
Okay, for the
I would like to take
Yep.
two more, if you can remember what you were going to say about that. More questions? Yes.
Yes, good morning. My name is Helle Agard, and I work for REACT, Action on Antibiotic Resistance, an organization based at Uppsala University. So one comment, one question. The comment, obviously I work in the area of antibiotic resistance, and the PCV vaccine is an incredibly important tool for reducing, you know, infection in the first place and the need to use antibiotics. So of course it's a big sorrow that there is, you know, a lack of introducing and rolling out this vaccine in many countries. And I would just make the point that if we were able to do that and there were universal access to the PCV vaccine, studies show that we can avoid using up to 11.3, I think, million doses of or daily use of antibiotics per year. That's an enormous amount of antibiotics and an enormous amount of potential resistance that we can avoid. So there is really a urgent need to find a solution to scale up the introduction and the use of this vaccine. And I want to ask you in that context, because I know that you guys have been working on the patent landscape and understanding what barrier that poses to the introduction of other candidates that could increase competition and bring down the price. And I know that Pfizer has just gotten a patent granted in India. What does that mean for the PCV vaccine candidate that was in the pipeline for the Serum Institute of India? Will that delay it? Will it block it completely? I think that's a huge important question globally. And then the second question, I've been listening to the discussion. I came in a little bit late, but I think it's been a very honest and very good discussion. And I would say I've used to work in Brussels before, so I've worked with your European counterparts. REACT has also worked in these public-private partnerships that are funded by the European Union, the Innovative Medicines Initiative, exactly on trying to find new models of innovation for antibiotics. And I have to say that the discussions with companies has been incredibly difficult in trying to find a new model forward. But I get a different vibe from you when you're sitting here, and I find a much more constructive tone and a much more honest tone. So I'm wondering what your leverage is within the European Pharmaceutical Industry Association and even the global one, because I do think we need to get some voices in there that are much more aware of of the changes that needs to happen and how urgent they are. And I think the Swedish Pharmaceutical Industries Association is one of the most reasonable voices I've heard in a long time. So.
Yes, Sweden will save the world. Anyone else? Eugène?
Always.
Sweden is the answer.
Two questions. My first one is probably linked to the question our friend here asked. It's about a transition from the low-income countries to middle-income countries, because I had the experience of discussing with one health ministry in Rwanda, and she was talking about the fear some countries have to be upgraded from low-income countries to middle-income countries, because they know that the coverage they have today when it comes to vaccine is going to be worse when they pass to the upgraded to that. So what is done to, reassure them and prevent maybe those fears and so forth and so on? That was my first question. Second question, what do you see as point of hope when it comes to solve these matters that are really important for the future of our kids?
Nice.
Thank you. Short answers.
Yeah.
And
well, forecasting, no, not a good enough. In some ways, it would be easy, as I said before. Well, we want 100% coverage of all children being born. That's easy, you know. It's just, we know it's 130 millions being born every year in the world. So it's easy. You just calculate 130 million times all the doses you need, and that's it, you know. But it's much, much more complicated, of course, because many different actors, you know, what vaccines to choose. If there's one actor on the market, then the other one withdraws. So you don't have a negotiating partner maybe for the next one. So very, very complicated. At the EU level, we did a recent study on procurement and what were the best deals and ways. And it's very clear in the EU countries who responded, about 30 countries, there was a 10-fold difference between the fully vaccinated child in the EU countries. And those paying the most were those who had social insurance and then a decentralized procurement system. So better off you are if you have, you know, tax-funded vaccines and if you are a procurement at the national level. Now there are EU discussions also even at a higher level. So saying that, you know, we need to get together to have a good full system in the EU countries. So the EU Commission is interested in finding, you know, what are the supply chains, what are the actors, and then trying to forecast. Because industry, and that I've learned in the last years when we've had shortages in Sweden, you need to be able to give good forecasting. You know, you want to have a long-term commitment. You want to have guaranteed volumes, ensure guaranteed volumes to be able to sell. Well, correct me if I'm wrong, Dag.
Yeah.
And then we are all interested in having stockpiles. because that you will sell more and we will have more stable access to the vaccine. So, so those are some of the things that we need to work on and understand better.
Maybe to your question on what, in terms of what are the possible solutions for Gavi transitioning countries? I mean, right now, with the 30% of Gavi countries that are in transition, and I've heard, further to your point of the Rwandan government being concerned about, you know, it's a shame when a government is concerned about its economic development because of the implications of what it will have for their health system. And that's pretty heartbreaking. And I've heard a minister in Sudan, and this was in 2009, I believe, say this is not graduation, this is expulsion, you know, use that sort of language. So, I mean, if it was easy, then it would have been done. But I think some solutions are that, you know, we need firmer commitments from industry for those countries transitioning out of Gavi support. Right now, when you look at their pricing commitments, it's really a patchwork quilt of what each company has committed to Gavi transitioned countries. There are some companies which have committed to a 10-year price freeze, so at least governments have a 10-year predictability of what prices they'll have to pay. And then there's some companies that have really not committed to anything at all. So I think first would be bringing that patchwork quilt of pharma commitments to Gavi transition countries into something more uniform. Because right now it's really voluntary commitments. So I think that's one thing that Gavi and the Gavi Alliance could do to help countries in transition. And then in terms of the middle-income countries, the countries that have never been, that have never benefited from Gavi support, I think what we need to do is to help them get a fair shake. So this is not easy, but this is looking at how can we support them in pooled procurement initiatives. UNICEF's supply division procures vaccines for, I believe, about 100 countries. So that's 20-something more than just the Gavi cohort. I mean, they procure, I believe, more than $1 billion worth of vaccines for Gavi countries each year, but they also do have some governments that they're serving. So they have a huge amount of expertise in how do you pool procurement, how do you negotiate with industry for a basket of countries. So, you know, rather than leaving all these middle-income countries to their own negotiating, how do we help them to organize and be a bit more uniform so that there are clear prices and more predictable prices, and we don't have this incredible range of prices being charged, as Ann spoke about.
So pooled, plus you then have the V3P arm of being able to have a more intelligent discussion on prices. Yeah,
exactly. And as WHO would call it, you know, their work in the market intelligence side, how to equip countries with information so that they can get the best deal. You know, there are right now governments like the government of Jordan, which last year, Jordan is not eligible for Gavi support. They wrote to Gavi and appealed to Gavi, can we please have access to your prices, because Jordan doesn't have PCV in their routine immunization schedule because they haven't been able to afford it, and they have this massive influx of refugees. And the Jordanian government is doing a great job in terms of offering their health services to all the refugees, which we want to support. But we want them to be able, and they don't want to differentiate between buying for something for our population and buying for refugees, which is really important. But, you know, Gavi doesn't have it within their remit to extend their prices to non-eligible countries. But that's just one little anecdote. May we get to the patents bit later, or would you like us to go into patents?
It was two people asking about it, so if you want to, about why hasn't the low price PCV been coming out?
So I part of it is attributable to patents, but I don't want to say that it's uniquely an issue of patents. I mean, I think there has been a very interesting change in the global dialogue on the role of patents in vaccine development, because even just 5 years ago, it was basically being dismissed as a reason why there wasn't further market entry. People were saying it's not an issue of patents, it's an issue of technical know-how, it's an issue of capital, skills, workforce, regulatory issues. It's not an issue of patents. But we've been investigating for the past 3 years by interviewing different developing country manufacturers based in India, Brazil, and elsewhere, what role patents do play in their vaccine development. And actually, it is a large attributable role in terms of their product development. They have to invest a huge amount of resources in just doing a patent landscape. And I am not an intellectual property specialist, so I won't pose as one. But the little that I do know is that, you know, there are patents that are taken out at every single step in the vaccine development process now. So in starting materials, in composition, in how vaccines are being used, there are an enormous landscape of patents that have been taken out by these originator companies, which do indeed influence how a developing country vaccine manufacturer can develop their product. They either first they have to invest a ton of resources in just figuring out what those patents are. And patents, there isn't a there's not one patent that's then recognized around the world. Patents are taken out in every single country. So if they want to market their product somewhere, they have to do a patent landscape for every single country and where they intend to market it. So that's just an upfront investment that they have to make. And then there are a range of solutions. If a patent is a barrier, they can license in a patent, but which comes with risks, costly. They have to do smart in-licensing, or they can try to do a workaround to not infringe on any of those patents, but sometimes there literally is no other technical solution for developing a vaccine. So just, one bit that patents do play a very large role. And as Helle mentioned, in India, one particular patent that Pfizer has been applying for in a number of countries, including India, where it was just granted a compositional patent looking at how they conjugate different streptococcus pneumonia serotypes on a carrier. And it's very interesting to look at how this patent has been treated. Originally it was granted by the EU Patent Office. Then it was challenged by multinational companies and it was revoked. Pfizer is now appealing that revocation, and it's up in court right now in South Korea. In India, we are now looking at the legal tools that we can to appeal that grant, which has been done. But so there are a number of areas of work happening in the area of patents. But yes, I mean, the feedback from developing country vaccine manufacturers is that patents play a role. I think specifically on the Serum Institute of India's product that's being developed, we understand that they have done a workaround, so this patent wouldn't be infringed. But there are other Indian companies that are also challenging that patent. There's another Indian company that has challenged that Pfizer patent in court too. So this is a new area that we'll be following with a lot of interest.
I think that's a nice bridge to Dag's final comments.
Regarding forecasting first, I think you're right. It's not easy to be a company either. Because you also need to factor in to what extent you will win the business or not if there is competition, and that's an uncertainty in itself. And also we obviously have situations where product lines fail and things happen. So that could come both ways. Either you gain a lot of business, you can't meet the demand, or you lose a lot of business because it's your own product line that failed. So, but then finally regarding forecasting, as I said before, the companies together cannot engage in a kind of a collaborative forecast, because that would be clearly very close to competition law and problems that relates to splitting up a market and things that you as an industry cannot engage in whatsoever. And that's one part. And then regarding thank you for that comment regarding the being reasonable in the way of talking here. But there is always a tension also within the company. You have different roles. You have those that are kind of defending the top line and the bottom line in the P&L, and you are those that are in other roles that are looking after long-term sustainability of your business, and you're looking at different. So in that type of tension will happen, will also exist within the company and between, for instance, the industry perspective and the company perspective, which might have different horizons. But as I said, we do engage in things like the IMI and things, and obviously do that in collaboration with our European organization as well as then the international. So that's as much as I can say. I'm afraid I can't promise that I will change the companies directly.
So, and with that, I think you were allowed to have the final contribution to this seminar, because time is running out. Thank you so much to the three of you for joining. I'm sure we'll have other occasions in the future to engage. And please do have a look on our MSF Access website. All the materials are there. Share it, read it, challenge it, question it. This is very much the type of dialogue we want to have in the future. And thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Ja, tack.